Hello and welcome to a new episode of Constructing Legends with the Violet Howler, a literary analysis of Voltron Legendary Defender. For most of my last 8 videos, I've done what I can to avoid discussing the subject of romance in the series as much as possible, because the show's fandom has a well-deserved reputation for toxicity and cyberbullying when it comes to discussion of which characters would or now should have ended up together romantically. For the last decade, I've personally witnessed fans of certain relationships send the most graphic threats and suicide-baiting comments toward everyone, from fellow fans to the families of the people who make the show, over perceived support for the quote-unquote wrong ship. As a result of this, many criticisms and negative reactions to the legitimate issues with the final season have been dismissed as angry shippers bitter that their OTP didn't become canon. And even among fans who recognize the final season's problems, discussion of the evidence that the season was edited after completion on the orders of someone higher up to change the story from how the writers wanted to end it has historically been met with similar accusations. But whether people like it or not, romance is a textual part of the story in one capacity or another. And as I've touched on in my Kingdom Hearts videos, when romance is a textual part of the narrative, it's impossible to get the full picture of a creative team's intentions if you ignore what the story is presenting when it comes to romance. So for today's video, we're going to talk about how the meddling of the final season pushed or suppressed certain romantic endgames, and how the show's themes, parallels, and character arcs, combined with cast and crew comments, tell us which ones the writers actually wanted. Before we get started on the pairings whose canon status was affected by the meddling of World Events Productions, let me first lay out which ones were not affected, or at least not to the extent that I need to cover them in this video. The executive meddling of World Events Productions didn't have any effect on the relationships of secondary or tertiary characters like Pidge's parents or her brother Matt's relationship with that one robot rebel. Nor was there any effect on minor pairings that were never confirmed one way or the other, but were not a major focus to begin with in either the final season or the show as a whole, such as the implied ship tease between Hunk and Shay. And while the relationship between Lotor's generals Ezor and Zethrid was impacted by the executive meddling of the last 2 seasons, that meddling only affected whether Ezor was still alive and not the status of the relationship itself. When talking about romance in the final season, the biggest thing to discuss is the relationship between Lance and Allura. Because the season starts with a whole episode dedicated to them getting ready for and ultimately going on their first date, and they get multiple scenes throughout the rest of the season that portray them as a couple. But as I talked about in my Lance video, there's evidence of multiple romantic moments between him and Allura in the last 2 seasons being last-minute edits rather than organic parts of the story. And while I sympathize with people who like the idea of him and Allura as a couple, cast and crew comments, along with the themes of his character arc, do not lend themselves to the pairing staying together throughout the entire season. Because them staying together throughout the whole season contradicts everything the cast and crew stated about where things would end up for him when it came to romance. From the fact that showrunner Lauren Montgomery said that what Lance looked for in a romance wasn't what he needed, only for him to get together with the girl he'd been doggedly pursuing since day one, to the fact that his voice actor Jeremy Shada promised that he would be somebody's first choice when it came to romance, only for Lance to end up as Allura's rebound after her breakup with Lotor. In terms of his character arc, his romantic pursuit of the future Mrs. Blue Lion, as he once put it, is deeply intertwined with his insecurities about his self-worth. He doesn't feel his contributions are important because they aren't big and flashy, so he tries to make himself stand out in order to feel seen. And in the first episode of the final season, his family treated being seated at the grown-ups table during dinner as conditional on romantic success, framing his efforts to make himself look cool and special as an attempt at making himself more attractive to a potential partner. Meanwhile, his casual disregard for Allura's interests, when combined with how quick he is to try and spend alone time with other girls even after confessing his feelings to her pet mice, paint Lance as more in love with the fantasy she represents than with her as a person. So as a result of all that, the two of them getting together fails to meaningfully resolve his arc. And not only that, but the portrayal of his pursuit of Allura and the way their relationship is written in Season 8 clashes with the themes of her arc as well. As I outlined in my previous video, Allura's journey maps onto Maureen Murdoch's model of the heroine's journey. And as I've talked about in my Kingdom Hearts videos, the romantic relationships in a heroine's journey usually have an element of social commentary about cultural expectations as a result of the framework's origins as a critique of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. And the social commentary implied by the portrayal of Lance and Allura's relationship over the course of the series has some unfortunate implications for them becoming a couple. From the moment they meet, the show consistently portrays Lance acting possessive of Allura and entitled to her attention, especially whenever he perceived another guy as a potential romantic rival.
Wait a minute. Keith and Allura? In the middle of the night? You don't think they're sitting in a tree?
Contact the pod.
Yes, contact that pod!
It is my honor to meet you, Princess.
You and I, a royal alliance between Altean and Galra.
How about we don't imagine that?
Yeah, I'm with Pidge. Let's get this guy out of here pronto, right, Hunk?
And when he confessed his feelings to her pet mice, he talked about how she wouldn't take him seriously because he's just a boy from Cuba and doesn't have anything to offer in a relationship, unlike Lotor the Space Prince. Which dismisses Allura's agency and frames her interest in Lotor as being solely due to the material resources he can offer, rather than how the audience watched the two bond over their shared Altean heritage and everything they've lost. I've seen fans of the Lance and Allura pairing argue that their dynamic is meant to be like that of Sokka and Suki in Avatar The Last Airbender, or like Belle and the Beast in Disney's Beauty and the Beast, where the girl only starts to like the guy back after he matures and grows out of his earlier obnoxious behavior. And I can understand the appeal of that. But the way the relationship was presented in the final season not only failed to have Lance articulate that his earlier behavior was wrong, but actually had him double down on the attitude he was supposed to have grown out of. In Season 6, he made a sincere effort to console her after her breakup with Lotor without making it about himself or him finally having a chance at wooing her. Yet at the start of Season 8, he's back to acting hostile and possessive over the idea of her dating anyone other than him, as we see when Hunk talks about the TV show Earth made based on the Paladin's exploits.
Plus, I think they're hinting at some romance between him and Allura.
What? Keith and Allura? No, it should be Lance and Allura!
And in the first episode of Season 8, his mother brushes off his efforts to flirt with Allura and get her attention in prior seasons as being all talk, which some fans found uncomfortably reminiscent of how similar attitudes and behavior toward women in real life has been dismissed as just boys being boys or locker room talk. Then, the series makes a point to have not one, but two scenes where Lance interacts with one of Allura's male parental figures, and the focus is on them judging his worthiness as a suitor. Yet neither of those conversations bring up how she feels, or the fact that her choices do not depend on parental approval, and instead that old-fashioned trope of the boyfriend needing the father's approval to have a relationship with a girl was played completely unironically. Meanwhile, the only reason Allura went on a date with him in the first place was because Romel talked her into it. And the only times we see the two of them spending any significant time together alone as a couple without other people around, Allura is melancholy and sad, focused entirely on her worries over their current situation. These details all add up to frame Allura and Lance's relationship as a socially approved but emotionally unsatisfying box that pressure from those around her and her own grief over Lotor have pushed Allura into, as opposed to being what she really wants deep down. Meanwhile, what would resolve Lance's underlying motives for pursuing her would either be learning that he doesn't need a romantic relationship to be happy, or ending up with someone else who's been there all along and likes him for who he is instead of just because he's there. And the fact that Lance is consistently shown being homesick for life on Earth and his family throughout the show indicates that his endgame love interest should ideally also be someone who's going to be living on Earth most of the time rather than spending all their time in space. While any scenes overtly acknowledging it were most likely cut as a result of World Events Productions meddling with the final season, the show does have a consistent thread of moments throughout the series hinting that the love interest who best fits that criteria is Pidge. She's the only Paladin shown spending most of their time on Earth in the series finale once the war is over, and as I pointed out in my first Voltron video, Pidge's brother Matt in the scene where the two of them are building a robot together looks like someone drew Lance and then retroactively photoshopped Matt's colors onto him. Just look at that hair! Which implies that the original ending would have had Lance and Pidge working at the garrison together back on Earth, while Shiro, Keith, and Hunk all pursued post-war careers in space. Meanwhile, Pidge's scenes in the first episode of Season 8 indicate that she is not happy about the idea of Lance and Allura on a date together, getting visibly uncomfortable when she's told about it. And though prior seasons demonstrated she had no issues with others being in relationships, ranging from affectionately teasing Hunk to enthusiastically acting out a hypothetical Lotura proposal, she consistently reacted to Lance's romantic pursuits with hostility or mockery.
Does Allura talk about me when I'm not in the room?
Oh yeah, all the time.
Really?
Yeah. She's all like, "Ooh, Lance, he looks so fine, I'm all a Twitter." Then she turns red and she makes me swear not to tell anyone.
I knew it! Whoops.
So it's not simply the specific combination of Lance and Allura that Pidge is bothered by, or even romance as a whole, but the idea of Lance with other girls in general. But unlike Lance's willingness to just get her generic blue lion plushie from a carnival when Allura asked for something sparkly, Pidge is shown throughout the final season consistently making personal sacrifices in order to ensure that Lance and Allura can be happy together. In the first episode of the season, she gives up a copy of a video game that she's waited years to play so that Allura can get something nice to wear for her date with Lance. Then Pidge's robot companion that followed her around at the beginning of the episode conveniently happens to be at the same park where Lance and Allura go on their date and takes a commemorative photo for them. And when Lance goes to win Allura a prize at the carnival in what is now Season 8, Episode 8, Clear Day, Pidge volunteers to help him get Allura a gift. Then when she finds something that fits Allura's tastes, Pidge goes out of her way to bargain with her mother and put up with taking souvenir family photos with her parents for the sake of getting the game tokens needed to win enough tickets for it. And while we don't get as many moments to imply Lance being attracted to Pidge as we do the other way around, the show does give us moments of him being actively protective over her in a way that we don't see him doing with any of the other paladins. When the team is being interrogated by Zethrid and Ezor in Season 7, Episode 3, The Way Forward, Lance is the only one in the group who is proactive in trying to keep the generals turned pirates from grabbing Pidge.
Don't you touch her!
Which contrasts how the paladins only react after she's already been yanked out of their reach. Not to mention that when deciding the travel arrangements for the voyage to Earth in the previous episode, Lance's choices just so happened to set things up in a way that Pidge had her whole lion to herself to play video games in peace without having to deal with any passengers. So I strongly believe that all of these details indicate that the most likely intended endgame for Lance was for him to get together with Pidge at some point in the final episodes after him and Allura broke up. But even if you don't look at the underlying social commentary of Lance and Allura or the themes of their arcs, them being an endgame romance doesn't fit with the patterns of the show's overall plot. Because Season 3, Episode 7 reveals that the incident that set the entire story in motion was ultimately caused by the romance between Zarkon and Onerva. That Zarkon loved his wife so much that he caused a chain of events that led to the destruction of his home planet in order to keep her from dying. Meanwhile, as I talked about in my previous video, Allura's journey is the central pillar that the rest of the show's narrative is built around, and she's framed as the good version of Onerva. So it stands to reason that Allura's endgame romance should logically be one that serves as a foil to Onerva's marriage with Zarkon, the good ending that contrasts the inciting tragedy. But Lance has no parallels or similarities to Zarkon whatsoever in order to make that work. The one moment between Lance and Allura that calls back to Zarkon and Onerva has him echoing Onerva's line calling Zarkon to wake up for her when he was in a coma back in Season 3.
You brought me back to life long ago. Now, come back for me.
Come back to me.
Yet outside of that one single instance, Lance doesn't have anything tying him to the parallel of Zarkon and Hagar. In contrast, Allura's other romantic relationship, Lotor, invites comparison to Zarkon on multiple levels. Not only is he Zarkon's actual flesh and blood child and trying to prove himself different from his father, but he briefly wields his father's paladin weapon that Zarkon had hoarded for millennia, and eventually replaces Zarkon as the Emperor of the Galra. Meaning that when he and Allura get together in between episodes during the first half of Season 6, the Galra were once again being ruled by an emperor who was in love with an Altean alchemist. In fact, some fans were able to figure out that much like how Pidge's brother was traced over Lance during the garrison scenes in the epilogue, Lance and Allura during that moment of echoing Onerva looked like someone traced over Allura and Lotor respectively. because the shading of the blankets in the scene of Lance at Allura's bedside in that scene makes it look like her legs have suddenly grown at least a whole head longer in her sleep. And if you zoom in on her torso, you'll notice that her forearms are 2 different lengths, as if one of them had been photoshopped. Meanwhile, in terms of Allura's journey, Lance is also among the voices in her life who treat her as uniquely fragile and consistently demonstrate a lack of trust in her decisions, despite them ultimately proving to be necessary. Which contrasts how Lotor, after he gets to know Allura, displays complete confidence in Allura's ability to handle the challenges in front of her. He treats her as capable and powerful even when she doesn't believe it herself.
There may be something in here that contains secrets that Hagar was unable to unlock, but you can. You just have to concentrate. I know you have the power within. You are a true Altean alchemist.
You must replicate your father's work if we are to use this ship to enter the quintessence field.
But how?
Something you learned in Orion.
Trusts her to know what she's doing during their visit to Orion, even when it runs counter to his self-preservation instincts, and pushes Allura to use every resource at her disposal in order to achieve her goals.
Perhaps we are not using all the tools at our disposal. Close your eyes and just let yourself feel the energy around you.
All the power in the universe at your fingertips, and you still fear using it!
Be that as it may, she's too powerful. There's nothing I can do to counter her abilities.
You are mistaken. Everything you need is here.
So I do not think it's very surprising that unlike how Allura had to be talked into going on a single date with Lance by others, she was enthusiastic about spending time with Lotor once she warmed up to him over the course of Season 5. Even after their breakup, the show demonstrated that despite everything they said and where they left off, Lotor and Allura still cared about each other. Because after they defeat him in the Season 6 finale, she tries to insist on saving him instead of abandoning him in the quintessence field.
But we can't just leave him!
Then when Allura sees him in her dream sequence during Season 8, Episode 8, Clear Day, her dreams in that episode are framed as a blatant metaphor for, well, an activity that the production crew would never be allowed to openly reference or acknowledge in a show rated as appropriate for 7-year-olds.
They had sex.
Allura dreams about her ex standing over her, whispering in her ear about becoming one, and then wakes up covered in sweat with the flower on her nightstand having spontaneously wilted. And after taking the rift entity inside herself and seeing a vision of Lotor, she wakes up with a tiny organism inside her that others criticize her for putting there and try to encourage her to get rid of it as if it were an unwanted pregnancy. Quite frankly, it's about as subtle as that scene in Avatar: The Last Airbender where Zuko walks into Sokka's tent and finds him waiting for Suki in his underwear with a flower and romantic candles. And even if you ignore the evidence in the narrative itself of where Allura's feelings lay, a moment in one of the showrunner's interviews with AfterBuzz after Season 8 came out implies something happened behind the scenes to make the pairing a risky topic of conversation. Because after fellow showrunner Joaquim Dos Santos commented on how beautiful Lotor and Allura together looked, Lauren Montgomery warned that he was heading into dangerous territory.
I will say he was beautiful. He had beautiful hair.
He did.
And him and Allura together look beautiful together.
This is very true.
You're treading on some
But
dangerous
I will,
So based on all of these details and the patterns of the series, I strongly believe that Lotor and Allura were ultimately meant to get back together in the original cut of the final season before World Events Productions meddled. But in terms of narrative patterns, the positive contrasting of Zarkon and Hagar's tragic relationship is not limited to Allura and Lotor alone. As I touched on in my Shiro video, the resolution of the clone plotline and Shiro's reaction to it are positioned as a mirror of Unurva's attempts to distance herself from her actions as Hagar. And while the show doesn't remark on it much compared to his career as a pilot, he does demonstrate a background in science, much like how Season 3 revealed that Unurva got her start as a researcher. Both of them have their hair permanently turn white over time as a result of their experiences, which also give them the ability to generate energy-based attacks from their hands. So logically, Shiro's intended endgame romance should have been with someone who's framed as a foil to Zarkon, just like Lotor was for Allura. Obviously, things with Shiro in the romance department were complicated by the fact that the writers wanted to make Shiro gay and had to fight a lengthy battle against the intellectual property owners to be allowed to do so. And by the time they finally got the green light as the 7th season released, according to Joaquim Dos Santos, the final season was pretty much done and they had no money left in the budget. So all they could really do when fans lashed out over the death of Shiro's ex-boyfriend was add in a last-minute wedding to a random Garrison background extra, because that was all that they could feasibly do with the time and money they had left. And we know it was added last minute because director, supervising producer, storyboard artist, and animator Ki-Hoon Ryu posted an in-progress shot from what turned out to be the wedding scene 2 months after Season 7 released, and captioned it his last work on Shiro. But if they hadn't added the wedding to the final season, things for Shiro when it came to romance would have most likely had to have been kept ambiguous, leaving just enough breadcrumbs for viewers to hopefully pick up on, but not officially confirming anything to avoid censorship from the IP owner. Because even though the writers didn't get the go-ahead to portray Shiro as openly gay until very late in production, the show does lay the groundwork for a potential romance involving him that does serve as a foil to the relationship between Zarkon and Hagar. Just like how Unurva's marriage to Agalra, who later became the Black Paladin of Voltron, was one of her most central relationships in the story, Shiro's most important relationship in the plot is also shown to involve Agalra, who later flies the Black Lion. Now, before my channel attracts any death threats over my analysis of Keith and Shiro's relationship, I do want to address that I am aware certain segments of the fandom are put off, to put it mildly, by romantic readings of their bond due to the visible age difference between the two. Oceans of metaphorical blood have been shed online over how old Keith was when he and Shiro first met and how big of a gap there is between their ages, which was in turn exacerbated by the fact that Paige was the only Voltron Paladin whose age was ever confirmed in the show itself, while answers for the others were either vague, contradictory, or from sources whose authority was questionable. I already did a Tumblr post years ago breaking down the show's timeline based on the backstory details in the show itself, which I plan to turn into a video sometime in the future. But to sum up my findings without derailing the whole video, all I will say on the issue is that the background details of the show's lore indicate that the age difference is much smaller than the discourse makes it out to be, even before the Quantum Abyss aged Keith an extra 2 years. Even before you get into the show itself, the possibility of other popular Keith pairings becoming canon was consistently shot down by cast and crew comments. In an interview with the sadly defunct Form podcast series run by The Nerdist, Lauren Montgomery explicitly stated that Legendary Defender would not be having Keith and Allura become a couple as had been the case in previous iterations of the franchise, saying that their interactions and bonding when they snuck out of the castle in Season 2, Episode 6, Ark of Taujir, were nothing more than the writers giving a nod to that aspect of the brand's history while the modern show went in its own direction. And both showrunners repeatedly told fans that Keith and Lance as a couple was not going to happen, no matter how insistently Clance fans kept pushing for it. Some fans thought that the show was building up a romance between Keith and Lotor's former general Aksha based on the emphasis their connection received in Seasons 3 through 6, and her fellow generals making the assumption in Season 7 that she's in love with him.
I should have known you'd show up once we got the Paladins. She's always been sweet on that one with the flippity hair. Oh look, Aksha, it's your favorite Paladin.
So do you guys actually know each other?
Yeah, don't you remember how she never wanted to kill him?
Oh, I guess it is true love.
And when she tells the Paladins about her motives for leaving Lotor, the scene emphasizes her path leading her to Keith specifically.
But I knew I had to find my own path, and it led me to you.
However, at SAC Anime 2018, Aksha's voice actor Erica Luttrell told a fan that while a romance between Keith and Aksha had been planned early on, the plotline was scrapped before any dialogue could be recorded for it. And after the editing of Season 7 resulted in Ezor being killed off before the fan backlash to her fate got her added back in, the edited version of The Grudge was implied to be setting Aksha up with Lance's sister Veronica to make up for killing half the show's other major lesbian couple. In contrast, the cast and crew were consistently showing support for the idea of Shiro and Keith as a couple from day one. Just 2 weeks after the first season dropped on Netflix, episode director Chris Palmer posted a drawing of Shiro smiling fondly at the camera, captioned "Shiro loves you, baby," with the hashtag "he is looking at Keith." In January 2018, supervising producer and storyboard artist Ki-Hoon Ryu did a live doodle on Instagram of Keith blushing while hugging Shiro possessively from behind. Pidge's voice actor Bex Taylor Klaus once posted a photo on Snapchat from watching Season 1 on their TV of Keith breaking Shiro out of quarantine in the first episode and captioned it "Ninja Mullet finds his true love." And before the first season had even come out, Shiro's voice actor Josh Keaton was the one who coined the fandom name for the pairing, Sheath. Aside from the discourse around the age difference, certain corners of the fandom try to argue that Keith and Shiro's bond is strictly platonic, or even that they outright view each other as siblings, due to the fact that Keith tells Shiro in Season 2 that,
"You're like a brother to me."
And in their fight during Season 6, Episode 5, The Black Paladins, he says,
"You're my brother,"
right before telling Shiro that he loves him. But as I've talked about in my Kingdom Hearts videos, it's a common experience for people who are not straight to refer to their same-gender crushes using sibling language. Either because they don't recognize their romantic feelings for what they are and therefore lack the vocabulary to properly articulate how they feel about the other person, or to deliberately conceal the romantic nature of their feelings out of fear that they'll be rejected at best if they confess how they truly feel. And there are cast and crew comments that support both readings of Keith's lines. In an interview on the official Let's Voltron podcast later in 2018 after the release of Season 6, story editor Josh Hamilton stated that the emotional focus of Keith's line was on the "I love you" part, and that Keith was trying to convey that Shiro meant everything to him, which definitely lines up with the not knowing how to properly articulate his feelings angle. But the fact that Keith isn't able to get through to Shiro until he outright says "I love you" can also argue in favor of the fear of rejection angle. Especially given that in a 2017 interview with AfterBuzz following the release of Season 2, Josh Keaton described the illusion of Shiro in the virtual mindscape of Keith's hopes and fears during his Blade of Marmora trials in terms of how
it seems like he's constantly scared that he's gonna do something or say something wrong and he's gonna lose Shiro.
Yeah.
But there's also another reason for Keith to use sibling language even if his feelings for Shiro are actually romantic in nature. Representation of LGBTQ relationships and identities in media marketed for kids like Voltron has historically been heavily censored. Even with people today in general being more accepting of queer people, companies still attempt to hide our existence out of fear of homophobic backlash. As a result, attempts at portraying things like a romantic relationship between two men have historically had to be hidden beneath a layer of plausible deniability. Much like how gay couples in real life have had to hide their relationships to avoid persecution, creators trying to slip subtle queer romances into their work have needed excuses for why two characters of the same gender who aren't related to each other are so close in order to avoid a crackdown from the censors. Which would also explain things like Crowlia introducing herself to Shiro after everything Keith told her about him by saying,
"Thank you for raising him to be the man he is today."
Which is not even a remotely accurate summary of how their history is portrayed when we finally get their backstory just 5 episodes later. Getting back to their relationship being a foil to other couples, Keith's unwavering dedication to Shiro is directly paralleled with Zarkon's devotion to Onerva. When Shiro and Onerva are each bedridden from illness or injuries as depicted in Season 3, Keith and Zarkon are the only ones shown at their bedsides. And both Keith and Zarkon are willing to go to extreme lengths to stay with the person they care about. Zarkon by destroying his entire planet in order to save Onerva's life, and Keith by choosing to fall to his death alongside Shiro after their fight in Season 6, rather than drop him and survive alone. They even have Shiro fighting Hagar and Keith fighting Zarkon in the Season 1 finale to really drive the point home of these characters mirroring each other. And since Shiro is a paladin as well, just like Zarkon and Keith are, the lines actually blur a little at points in regards to which of the Royal Galra couple he's paralleling. Because when both Zarkon and Shiro are recovering in Season 3, Keith and Onerva both implore them to return to duty for the sake of others. Yet when Shiro and Zarkon each end up in comatose states, they only wake up when Keith and Onerva appeal to their personal relationships with their respective Black Paladins. And much like how the narrative shows a noticeable contrast between Allura's relationships with Lance and Lotor, the flashbacks to Shiro and Keith's history in Season 7 Episode 1, A Little Adventure, contrast Keith against Shiro's previous romantic partner. Adam was introduced in the context of him breaking up with Shiro after the latter's decision to go on the Kerberos mission due to his concerns over Shiro's disease potentially getting him killed out there. But the previous scene had just established that the garrison's medical team had deemed Shiro healthy enough that him going into space was relatively low risk. So just like Admiral Sonda, Adam was treating Shiro like the existence of his disease automatically made him fragile, disregarding the judgment of medical professionals and demonstrating a lack of trust in Shiro to know his own limits. and when Adam presents his concerns to Shiro, he does so as an ultimatum, forcing Shiro to choose between his dreams and their relationship by presenting a false binary where going on the mission meant that Shiro's dreams were more important to him than his partner. In contrast, when Keith is informed of Shiro's illness, he doesn't try to talk Shiro out of pursuing his dreams or treat him like he's made of glass. He just asks Shiro what he's going to do, trusting him to know his own limits and respecting his final decision. And unlike how Adam was willing to give up on their relationship, Keith consistently demonstrates his refusal to give up on Shiro throughout the entire show.
Shiro is the one person who never gave up on me. I won't give up on him.
Because from the very first episode, Keith has consistently demonstrated that supporting Shiro both physically and emotionally is his #1 priority. He leaps into danger on multiple occasions in order to ensure Shiro's physical safety, from sparring matches against gladiator drones, to immediately rushing to disarm the bombs that he and his fellow Blades had just finished setting to sabotage the Kralzera in Season 5 the instant he sees that Shiro has landed in the blast zone. And when Shiro asks Keith in Season 3, following his rescue from nearly dying of oxygen loss on his quest to reunite with the team,
"How many times are you gonna have to save me before this is over?"
Keith immediately responds with,
"As many times as it takes."
In terms of emotional support, he backs Shiro's decision to pursue an alliance with the Blade of Marmora in Season 2, attempts to encourage him to keep trying to reconnect with the Black Lion after it shuts him out in Season 3, and keeps trying to reach out to Shiro when Hagar takes control of him in Season 6. As a result, for the majority of the show, Keith has been the only person Shiro was willing to be vulnerable with and put down the mask of the strong, fearless leader who's always in control. Meanwhile, Shiro has consistently demonstrated that this level of emotional and physical support goes both ways. So when all of this is taken together, the flashbacks to their past in A Little Adventure, which the episode framed as Shiro dreaming of how they met, can potentially be read as him realizing how he feels about Keith. Especially given that just 4 episodes prior, his reaction to seeing Keith for the first time in 6 months, which Keith experienced as 2 years due to the time dilation of the quantum abyss, making him, in Lance's words, bigger, cooler, and grizzled, Shiro gets flustered and stammers at the sight of him.
Attention, Altean Pod. Identify yourself.
Shiro, it's Keith.
Keith? Are you okay? Keith, it's so good to see you.
Why are we even attacking?
Look, Keith, everyone, calm down.
As if seeing this new, older Keith is making his brain go,
"Oh no, he's hot!"
And just to complete the trifecta of parallels to canon romantic couples, Shiro and Keith also have parallels with Keith's own parents, just like Lotor and Allura have with Lotor's parents. You have Keith's dad rescuing Krolia after she crash-landed on Earth, just like Keith himself did with Shiro in the first episode. You have Keith and Krolia getting dramatic close-ups when they find out that the person they love died without them knowing about it. And you even have Keith spending most of the series wielding his mom's blade while he gave his dad's clothes to Shiro as the basis for his casual outfit for the first 6 seasons. So I strongly believe that if not for World Events Productions meddling with the final season, the ending of the series would have done as much as the writers and animators could get away with to imply that Shiro and Keith had become a couple, assuming that they couldn't somehow get the green light to confirm it openly. I understand why many people dismiss criticism of the way the romances in the final season were portrayed and discussions of what parts of the season were changed because of the IP owners meddling as just shippers being bitter that their preferred pairing didn't happen. I've had a front row seat to just how vicious and toxic the behavior of the Voltron fandom has been when it comes to the love lives of these characters. But the reality is that romance is baked into the story of the show on a core level, from individual character arcs to the recurring patterns of the overall narrative. Even if the executive meddling hadn't happened, the show was never going to be written in a way that satisfied all corners of the fandom when it came to the characters' relationships. No matter what, some fans were going to be disappointed with the choices the creative team made in the romance department. And when there's multiple blatant signs of scenes and shots being cut, added, or altered at the last minute to change the direction of the narrative, it's important to recognize when those changes affect the romances when talking about what the creators' choices actually were. Because the fact that the edits end up pushing one romance to happen while scrapping others helps us piece together the potential motivations behind why these edits were ordered in the first place. Thank you all so much for watching. If you have any thoughts, observations, or counter-arguments regarding anything I've said here in today's video, feel free to share in the comments below. As always, if you want to be notified the next time I upload, be sure to click subscribe, and I'll see you all back here again on June 27th for my next video.